Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for inviting me into your home again this week. Happy to be here, and we're going to get right into it. I'm going to do a little intro for my guest, and then I will bring her on. I think you guys are going to enjoy this episode. We got some really good stuff to talk about here. I am welcoming this week Dr. Laura Anderson, and she is, I'm going to read from my little notes here, she is a licensed marriage and family psychotherapist. She is also the founder for the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery and the co-founder of the Religious Trauma Institute, which should give you some idea of what we're going to be talking about today. Now, she has just recently put a book out called When Religion Hurts You. And we're going to be talking about that book in this show. But I wanted to lead with a quote from somebody you all might know, Sarah Edmondson from The Vow, the NXIVM survivor who has her own podcast, a little bit culty, has said this about this new book. Quote, a brilliant blend of anecdotal and academic, this book offers a compassionate roadmap for those recovering from religious trauma. Dr. Anderson offers guidance on how to put lives back together and provides a thorough resource for mental health professionals to help them counsel others in the process. Poignant and personal, this book is a must-have for anyone in the muddy aftermath of their exit from high control or extreme religious groups. End quote. So, Dr. Anderson, Laura, thank you for being on my show here. Welcome to it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's truly a delight to be here. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Me too. I think this will be fun. We've really just met, but your work and everything you're doing, it's, as I was mentioning before, it's nice to find fellow travelers on this road of recovery and trying to help people along the way with this. Religious trauma is a very real thing. How did you, just to kind of intro you, how'd you get into this field, and what's your practice with all of this?
Yeah, well, I actually became a therapist before working specifically with religious trauma. I live in the South, right in the heart of the buckle of the Bible Belt. And so it's very common when you meet somebody, they say, what's your name and what church do you go to? As if it's just all one and the same, right? Yep. And so I, at the time when I moved to Nashville almost a decade and a half ago, I was still involved in church on some level. But I was going through my own, what we call like deconstruction, untangling process of what do I really believe this, these sorts of things. And I would just have clients trickle in, saying, hey, these things have happened to me. And I don't know if it's spiritual abuse. I don't know if it's just me. I don't know. Are these beliefs even bad? In the thing, as they were, coming in, I was going through it myself as well. I grew up in a high control religion. My father was a director at a fundamentalist Christian camp. We lived on site all year round. I have my Bible degree. I worked formally at a church. I did all the things. I was eat, breathe, sleep, what my denomination and religion was. It was my entire identity. And, really didn't have space to ask questions until I was, well into my adult years. And so as I was asking questions, I started encountering other people that were asking questions, except they were just sitting in my office. We didn't have social media and podcasts the way that we do now. And so it was kind of like hush, hush, right? You're not really talking about it in conversation because you're wondering, is it only me? And really, truly, the further I got into my own work, did my own healing, I started to see it more with my clients. And really, when the 2016 election happened, is when I think we started to see publicly what I would say like a mass exodus coming out of many high control religions, with people that were just incredibly disillusioned. What just happened here? This feels very opposite of what I've been taught. And they were starting to ask questions, but not only asking questions, they were starting to realize their bodies were having physiological responses. There was things that were happening there where they could maybe reject a belief, but things were still happening inside them. And there was everything from various mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, OCD, lots of hypervigilance, all the way to trauma, PTSD, CPTSD. And so yeah, I jumped in at that point. I was at my own place in my personal life and professional life where I had some knowledge. I had gained some trainings. I had gone through enough on my own and just really became a passion project. And now I guess my livelihood. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I, of course, understand, having, been raised in a high control group myself, the pressures and the traumas, but something you're speaking to that we don't really mention maybe often enough are the physical reactions.
Yes.
We talk about the sort of psychic pain of it and the trauma of it and how we don't feel good, but how that manifests is so often in physical feelings that you can't really explain. It's these triggers, I guess, right? And and those all by themselves can kind of serve as warning signs to us that something's amiss or something's wrong. But I think learning to listen to them is one of the hardest problems or difficulties we might have. What do you think about that?
I would agree with that because I think oftentimes, so we say, okay, here's this set of beliefs that I was given, and I'm going to cognitively untangle those and then find a new identity and believe new things and engage in new practices. And that's well and good. But I think what happens for most people is they go, okay, I have this new belief, but then I go and do XYZ thing. And there's this physiological response that's happening in my body. Maybe it's disgust or panic, or I'm just feeling really activated right now. And I don't know what is going on because I don't even believe that thing. And so we start to then also feel a deep sense of shame and confusion because what's happening in our body isn't matching our external kind of world and the thoughts that we've adopted. And so especially for those of us who have grown up in these high control groups or religions, or even been in them for an extended amount of time, we have to look at not only how did those messages live in our head, we have to look at how did they live in our bodies, right? We have to connect the mind and body together because they just simply can't be separate. And when we can understand that our brain creates neural pathways that send signals down to our body, and we have these automatic subconscious responses, when we can understand that, we can start to understand some of the ways that, I believe, for instance, sex before marriage is fine. My body is physiologically responding in a different way. And that's why, because just because I believe something different doesn't mean my body has caught up to that. But that's where we do start to see some of the mental health disorder, dis-ease, confusion, and things that we're now going, wow, we like religious trauma is trauma, right? And just like trauma from anything else. And so I think, it is important to understand this mind-body connection. Absolutely.
It kind of harkens back to that, the body keeps the score thing. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I really, really appreciate Bessel van der Kolk's work. It was so groundbreaking. Because he recognized like, hey, this therapy that we're doing, just like gradually exposing people to this threat, it's not really doing anything. And he and others like him, Judith Herman, Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, all these wonderful scientists and researchers started to recognize that, trauma is not in our head, it's in our bodies. Right. And when that shifted, it shifted the way that we viewed the human experiences, the nervous system, and ultimately treatment, therapy, resolving how that lives in our bodies and recovering from it.
Yeah, big time. I cannot tell you the number of times exactly what you described during the last 10 years of hashing through all the Scientology nonsense.
Yes.
That my mind was saying one thing and my body was going, yeah, okay, buddy, but whatever. That's that's good for you for thinking that, but no, we're not.
Yeah.
We're not done with this yet, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think religion is such where it's so powerful. It really hits us on every level. And so, and because we have this higher power figure that's all knowing or watches over us or, kind of sees everything and is ready to smite us, it adds this other level of fear and panic that we might not even be consciously aware of. But again, that doesn't just go away simply because we decided to not go to church or a meeting or be done with it altogether. It still lives in us for a long time, unless or until we actually deal with it.
Yeah, big time. A lot of people think about trauma and they think medical situations. They hear this word often in medical contexts on TV, ER, et cetera. Or they think about it in a military context with either PTSD from soldiers or combat situations or, shelling and explosions and all that. And obviously, there's a lot of good reasons to see there's a lot of trauma there. However, we then tend to devalue or not give acknowledgement to the trauma that can occur in everyday life, quote unquote. I'm doing an air quote thing again, right? And yet there it is. Growing up in a high control family, a high control group, meaning a situation where demands are being made on you that are unreasonable and are actually damaging to you, either emotionally or physically or sexually or all the above. How do you talk about or address, or even break the barrier of, hey, there's something here maybe we should be looking at when it comes to talking to your patients or talking to people about religious trauma? Because a lot of people are going to hear that and go, that's nonsense. There is nothing traumatic about religion. So how do we connect those dots for people?
Yeah, I can really appreciate that question and people who doubt that. I think a couple things, like colloquially, we have, exactly as you said, understood trauma as this big catastrophic event. And it certainly can be. However, trauma is not the thing or things that happen to us. It's the way that our nervous system responds to those things that happen to us. It is the things that are too much, too fast, too soon, that overwhelm our ability to cope and come back to a place of felt sense safety, internal safety. And so essentially that means trauma is highly subjective. What is traumatic for you may or may not be for me, and vice versa. I don't believe that there is anything that is inherently traumatic. So, because we see that we've got one soldier who goes off to war and experiences things like PTSD, and we have other soldiers who go off to war and come back and are very well adjusted, or may have, depression or anxiety, but not trauma, right? And so we have to leave the door open then for a bigger meaning, which is when you mentioned Bessel van der Kolk, that's where he started to go. And I think it's important to understand that, because that does open the door to consider that really anything could be traumatic based on a variety of factors that are often inside us that are beyond our control: our genetics, our DNA, our history, our environment, our access to safety, things like that. And so when we add on the religious piece, I am very careful to say, I don't believe that religion causes trauma inherently, again, right? But when we're a part of these religions that are so controlling and so demanding, and there's not the ability to escape them, especially for those of us who grew up in them, we are looking at, a potential trauma diagnosis because there was too much, too soon, too fast. And so I don't want to pathologize religion, certainly, but I do think it would be a disservice to people to just look at religion, how most people tend to, as a supportive, pro-social factor that we can gain identity, support, hope, these sorts of things. Certainly it can be for some. And if that is your story, great. I don't ever try to change anybody's mind on that. I work with whoever's in front of me. But I think when we look at really what is trauma, we have to consider a lot of different things. And I really consider religion to be under kind of the umbrella of complex trauma, which is where a lot of like developmental trauma is happening. So there may not be one or two really large events, right? Where we can point back and we say, it's this moment, this happened. When we're looking at complex or developmental trauma, we're usually looking at smaller, maybe like you said, kind of day-to-day things happening over time, consistently, persistently, and they're inescapable, right? So you think about the kid. I mean, I learned about hell. That's one of the first beliefs I ever learned about. And I was 2-3 years old, where, I can't fight back against that. I can't run away. I can't say no to my parents. I just have to take that in. And not only am I taking that in, it's coming from my caregivers who are supposed to be safe and loving. And they're telling me about this awful thing. So they're both instilling fear and the source of love. And a little child's brain doesn't know how to organize that. In fact, most big child's brains don't know how to organize that either, right?
Exactly.
To look at some of that and to go, okay, could it be that though there's not these huge instances, maybe clergy sexual abuse, maybe really kind of overwhelming altar calls or having to evangelize, like maybe we all have that, maybe some of us have those. But when we look at these kind of day-to-day things over time, that's where we start to see this. There wasn't a before or an after. This is just how it always was. And that's where we start to look at a more complex or developmental trauma.
Right, exactly. As we say, complex PTSD, CPTSD versus your one incident PTSD sort of modeling, I think is how it's sort of looked at. And it's a great point you're making, because a lot of people will focus on one or two memories that they have. At least it's been my experience in myself and dealing with other people, that they'll go, oh, well, it was this. And it was when I was 4 years old, my dad, blah, blah, blah. Or when I was 10 or when I was 20 or whatever it was. And they really fixate on that as a source, and can, I think, sometimes maybe miss the forest for the trees a little bit, because there are earlier life moments that are, as you mentioned, developmental trauma that we forget about. We don't even, it's just so part of who and what we think of as ourselves that we don't see it for it, or we don't have a memory of it. And so it's kind of lost in time for us. Does what I'm saying come up in therapy that you've given, or is this part of what's accounted for in the process?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people I've come in contact with where they'll say, oh, I don't have religious trauma because such and such thing didn't happen to me, right? That single incident. So I think a lot of times I do a lot of education with people to exactly what you were saying. So I can go like, hey, when we hear trauma colloquially, we're thinking the car accident, the war, that incident, right? Mm. And that can be traumatic. Absolutely. It can absolutely result in trauma. But that is what you said, single incident, or what we might call a shock trauma. And what is so key about that is it's a single incident, right? So there's a before, and then the thing happens, and then there's after.
Yeah.
Right. And so oftentimes when I'm working with clients where there are more of those single incident traumas, it's actually easier to work through those because they are more isolated incidents. As we go, okay, we can process through this thing right here, and then we can move on with relative ease as we kind of integrate that into life, and we're good. When we look at the complex trauma piece, or CPTSD, we don't usually have a before and after. Sometimes we do. Oftentimes domestic violence, for instance, that might result in CPTSD, and say perhaps you don't get into that relationship until you are an adult. The reason it might fall into that category is not because it has a before, or it doesn't have a before and after, but we look at how long it is. And so you're immersed in it, that inescapable factor. And so I think when we're looking at complex trauma, we're looking at a variety of factors. So again, even though there might not be these incidences that happen, it's inescapable, right? Like I don't have anywhere where I can go and get help. In many cases, the perpetrator is also a person who's supposed to be keeping us safe or comfort or nurturing, or has some sort of a more intense connection to us rather than just like the passerby person. We're looking at things that are happening consistently where this is just like, this is my life. I'm always in that state of fear or hypervigilance or walking on eggshells. And so it's those things that we develop and we have to adapt to. And for the complex trauma survivor, they would go, wait, is that weird? Like, is that not normal? Right? Like that's their baseline of normal. Right. And so a lot of the work then we're doing out of that is not to process every single specific moment, because that's just impossible. And there's so many that we wouldn't even remember. Right. But it's going, hey, how do we work to develop a felt sense of safety so that as I'm going through the world and I'm triggered or I'm seeing things that are, reminiscent of the past or whatever it is, I can develop new skills or I can access new skills that help me feel safe as I navigate through the world, so that I'm not constantly in a place of fear or hypervigilance or anxiety, isolation, anything like that.
Right. All makes sense there for sure. I'm wondering about, I'm wondering how you think about as a therapist and how you bring your clients to think about recovery from trauma. And let me present like as a I guess a counter to this, Dianetics, right? Okay, so I come up with Dianetics, and the idea of my entire life was trauma exists. Absolutely, it exists. They don't even use that word so much as other colloquialisms in Scientology, but trauma. Right? Pain, suffering, unconsciousness, whatever. And Hubbard posited that there are these moments of trauma that happen to people, and they happen all the time. And these moments contain charge that you can go back and sort of siphon out or take away from those memories. And by doing that, by removing that sort of negative energy, you are removing the traumatic effects of those memories. Now, that's a really wonderful theory. That is a theory that has so much appeal to people. Even if, and when they kind of come to understand the sales pitch of it, they go, well, shit, that sounds great. If you could do that for me, right? Like, wow. But I've come to learn over the years that that's not exactly how the mind is put together. And that's not exactly how our memories work. In fact, they don't work anything like that. And this is all 1950s hokum from Hubbard, right? But how do we talk about releasing or letting go of or getting rid of trauma? What does that look like in a modern context in therapy?
Yeah. So you might get different answers depending on who you talk to and kind of their modality, how they focus on trauma. I said earlier, trauma is not in the head, it's in the body.
Yeah.
I'm a body-based practitioner. So my certifications in trauma come from spending many years and many dollars, getting certified to process trauma through the body. There are a couple elements of Ron Hubbard's work that are accurate, right? Like anything in life, right? There's parts of a lot of things that are accurate, but sometimes not the whole thing. This idea of, okay, so we'll go like this. I believe, we're all animals, right? We're just a little bit more developed than like my little dog who's sitting right here, but she's a great lesson for me. Dogs don't have their prefrontal cortex fully developed like a human does. So what happens is when a real or perceived or remembered threat enters our sphere, our nervous system, which is designed to keep us surviving, goes on high alert, right? And goes, okay, there's danger. And it kind of activates the reptilian part of our brain. And that also activates the limbic part of our brain, which says, okay, so what do we do with that threat, right? And that's where we start to get things like fight or flight or freeze or fawn. And reactions that may not cognitively make sense, but we're just like in the moment, right? And we're going, right? So that those parts of our brains can rationalize any behavior, even if it's not rational. Now, humans, we have this more frontal part of our brain that's developed called the prefrontal cortex. And that's going to be where our thoughts and habits and cognitions and patterns and sequences and logic lives. And we think we live out of there pretty much all day, every day. Not really true, but we can kid ourselves a little bit. But that part of our brain, when something overwhelming comes in, that part of our brain kind of goes offline. So we're really acting from these more primitive parts of our brain. Yeah. And so what happens is that when our nervous system finally goes, oh, actually, we're okay, it kind of is able to settle a little bit. So when there's threat, you even notice, if I don't know if you're doing video for this, but like there's kind of this bracing, right? And our body mobilizes internally. And this is all very subconscious, beneath our conscious. So different chemicals are coming together to suppress certain functions like needing to eat or use the restroom, because that would be really inconvenient if you're trying to run away from a tiger, right? And then it mobilizes other energy so we can fight or flight flee, sorry, not flight. And so when our bodies go, okay, I've gotten away from the danger, the threat is mitigated, all of that stuff that's been mobilized needs a place to go. In trauma world, we call it completing the trauma cycle. So it might just look like, kind of shake that out, right? Or maybe it's crying or yelling or whatever it is. We see animals do this all the time. If you watch like the National Geographic channel, you see a gazelle who's being chased by a lion, and all of a sudden they fall over and they look like they're dead, and their breathing becomes really shallow. And what they're doing is they're trying to protect their survival. They want to stay alive, and the lion will kind of sniff around. They don't want already dead prey. And so they walk away. And then if you keep watching, the gazelle will spring up, kind of shake a little bit, and then hop away, right? And animals do that because that part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, has not yet developed. And they just know, hey, I've got all this extra stuff in my body. I got to get it out. And we go. But as humans, what we do is we go, oh, it's over. Oh, it wasn't that bad. I was just seeing things. I was making too big of a deal. That prefrontal cortex comes back online and tries to make meaning out of what happened, but it doesn't actually take away the energy that's coursing through our bodies. So if we don't have a way to release that, that's where it can start to kind of live in us. And I don't mean in like a woo-woo way, but adrenaline, cortisol, where it lives inside of us, that really can have over time these detrimental effects where we start to see things like chronic pain, autoimmune disorders, depression, anxiety, and yes, trauma. So when we're looking at how do we resolve that, we do have to go back into the body and release that energy that is already there. So Ron Hubbard's using words that are familiar to me, but it's not... It's usually not done through words. It's usually done through our body. And I'm not talking like the big cathartic, waving your arms around. Oftentimes it's just subtle shifts that our body's needing to kind of just complete that, get that energy out. And once it's out, it's not there anymore. Now, that doesn't mean you don't remember it. It doesn't mean you might not get triggered by it, but it doesn't have the same maybe intensity as it did before. So we have to look at it from that body-based perspective, a little bit animalistic, and to say, hey, how do animals, deer aren't constantly scared in the wild all the time, right? Because they're able to kind of shake that off. And so we're kind of tapping into our most primitive kind of creation here and going, we have the skills to do that as well. Does that make sense? I know that's a lot of information.
No, it makes sense to me, and I'm hoping that it's translating to the audience as well, because it's good stuff. This is exactly right. This is all body-based stuff, and I stress these things not because I'm trying to tell everybody out there that that all your spiritual beliefs are wrong. What I'm trying to say is we don't need to go there in order to explain this stuff.
Yeah. In fact, where people, so a lot of people come into therapy and they just want to talk. They got to get all the details out. And I do realize that can be very helpful. Our stories are powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to tell that or to have that witnessed and heard can be incredibly validating and healing, right? What I think most people don't understand is that we don't have to tell our stories. Our bodies are already doing that for us. So there's many times I will work with somebody where I actually have no idea what happened to them. I don't need to know what happened to them because they're able to say, I'm feeling this sense of, say, activation where I just want to run away. And I go, okay, we'll start there. We just go with that. Now, oftentimes they'll say, at the end, they'll be like, oh, here's what this means to me.
Yeah.
Right. But that meaning piece is just kind of one channel of like how we understand ourselves. And so I think that that's important too, because I think stereotypically, or you watch in entertainment, people, go into their therapist's office and they sit and they talk, right? And a lot of people are like, why would I want to talk about some of the worst things that have ever happened to me? Yeah. And I get it, right? Why would you? Why would you want to relive that? But when we go, hey, actually, you don't have to. Like there are ways where we can work with your body and help your body kind of resolve how that's living inside of you. And that may not ever mean you have to speak that person's name or tell that story. It oftentimes can bring a little bit of peace or safety that I get to choose what I want to say. I don't have to say this just because I'm in therapy and need to get it out, which I feel can be very empowering.
Yeah, I think it's great and not highlighted enough on my channel. So I'm glad we're talking about this because classic therapy, right? Psychotherapy especially is considered talk therapy, and I'm going to sit there and talk. Yes. And of course, you have to talk to your therapist. You do have to have interactions, but what you talk about and this idea of having to do regression therapy or go back and relive the thing again. There are small percentages of people that works on, according to studies I've read. I'm sure. Not everybody by a long shot. And so, so we don't have to do it that way in order to process and relieve this stuff. And that's really good news. I'm curious also about your thoughts about this. This is something kind of out of left field on this that just occurred to me, which is because we're talking about, body-based trauma and stress and feelings and stomach flippings and, nervousness and some of these feelings that come unbidden, unpredicted, and unknown where they're coming from. It is the job of our frontal lobes to try to figure out reasons and rationale for that. Even false answers are better than none. It seems to be the human condition, right? I'll take any answer better than none.
Right.
I'm wondering to myself right now whether this might be a factor in why people are drawn to some of these groups in the first place when we're talking about cults or high control groups, is they get these funny feelings and the groups are all too willing to tell them what those feelings mean. And then they're kind of trapped, because if they accept that interpretation, you mean it's my Thetan bouncing around in and out of my head? It's this thing, right? That's proof that I have a reactive mind because my stomach's doing flippy floppies right now. What would you say about this from your experience?
First, I agree. That's what I would say. First, cool. I don't know how intentional this was to begin with. But I do think that high control religion and other high control groups, cults, fundamentalism, have an understanding of the human psyche and our basic needs as humans, things like connection, feeling a sense of identity and, kind of being able to know how I exist. And then also having like a bigger purpose than themselves. Right. And so we look at groups like this and they offer some of these very basic human needs. And we are attracted to that. Even more so is as humans that have nervous systems, we thrive on certainty. What can I expect? What is right? What is wrong? Right. And so we may not like what is a yes or what is a no, But having an idea of what that is and like a plan to follow can feel really good. It can give us at least the illusion of safety. So if I do what is right or good or healthy according to this doctrine or rules or whatever, then I'm safe. And that might mean I'm connected to the group. I'm not being cast out. I'm not being fair gamed. I'm not being like any of these things. And we go, okay, this gives me a sense of worth and identity, safety, and connection. On the alternative, if I do these things over here, I have a set amount of, consequences that I can expect to receive. And so we may not like it, but we go, having that sense of certainty and stability feels better than what if? What if I don't do that? Right. So there really is some innate human pieces that religion has tapped into, or high control groups have tapped into, where they understand what humans need and want in order to thrive. And they say, we have the answer. And then when you put onto it a higher power or God figure or an eternal destiny, you're playing into humans' fears of things like disconnection, non-survival, things like that. And you're really then creating an environment where control can happen. And you can always put these caveats. You do these things or else. You follow these things. You give this money or else. And so we're playing into these really big fears that humans would naturally have of really extinction, of themselves at the most basic kind of core level. And so, yeah, I do think that what people are drawn to inside of a religion is also the thing that kind of eats them alive, right? They go, I want the certainty. And then that certainty is what is then used against them and used to control them.
Big time. And I love the fact you brought up certainty because, of course, and, from my past, Scientology has been labeled by Hubbard as the science of certainty.
Oh my gosh.
I love blowing people away with that one. Yeah, it's this old one, right? Yeah, Scientology is all about certainty, and it was promising that. And I wanted to get your view on this because I've talked about brains a lot on my channel off and on. Had some neuroscientists on for a while. Talked about the fact that the brain's primary function is prediction. That's what it's basically built to. It's monitoring and controlling the systems of the body, and it is predicting what's coming next. And it's always operating a microsecond ahead, right? And always, right? So all our perceptions, our awareness of what's going on is always a little bit behind where the brain's actually processing.
Yep.
Now, that all being said, and isn't that interesting, prediction becomes something really central to our life and function. And so when we are predicting properly, one could say, when everything is fully predictable, one could say, one has total certainty. Right? Total,
sure.
right?
Yes.
Right? And to the degree one is in an unpredictable environment, or one is being shown or proven to one that they are not certain what's happening, that they're not able to predict what's coming, they're thrown off. Right? Sure. And in fact, trauma might be framed, one way of framing it is moments of vast consequential unpredictability, right? That hit us.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Upside the head. And maybe that might be a feature of why some people are traumatized by certain events and others are not. It might have something to do with their going into that situation, what they expected or what they predicted would occur. That's not all of it. Obviously, there's the after effects and dealing with it. Could also be the reason trauma sticks. It could be because they just don't know how to deal with it or process it well. But I'm thinking about this forward part, this prediction part. Having said all that, what do you think about all of that and how that feeds into how we might develop trauma in the first place, or maybe if that's a factor, overcome it before it even starts?
Yeah, I've never thought of it in that way before, but I can absolutely see how that could transpire. And as you're talking, I'm going, okay, so then what is it? Because obviously we know that life is uncertain. As much as you plan and think we can predict, we can't.
That's right.
And so much of my own personal work and how I work with clients is for the unpredictable moments. So we might use the word trigger, right? And that could be, I mean, we cannot predict triggers. Sometimes we can. We go, oh, I'm going to be around that person, and I know they always get me so activated. But we can't know all of these things, right? We don't know when a smell is going to come our way and it brings us back, right?
Yeah.
And so much of what we do is this work of internal safety and stability of in those moments, essentially like, how are we going to troubleshoot, right? So this thing happened, and now I'm in this unfamiliar territory because even though I'm pretty sure I'm right here in this moment in 2023, I also feel like I'm back in 1993, right? And how I didn't plan for that. And so much of the work that we're doing, especially with folks who are in that under that complex trauma umbrella, is what I call integration, is bringing the past back to the present and saying, what do I have inside me, or who can I connect to that can help me feel a sense of presence and safety right now in this moment? And that comes from within us and does not have to be dependent on the factors outside of us. Now, it can always help when we're physically safe externally. That can often help us feel internally safe. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, because if we have those resources inside us to essentially roll with the punches, troubleshoot, go with the unpredictability, then it's not that things won't rattle us. It's that we don't, we bend, but we don't break, right? We think about those structures that can sway, but they don't topple over. And that's kind of what we're looking for. Because as much as we love that certainty, if we try to do that, if we make our lives about predictability and certainty, our lives get so tiny, right?
Exactly.
And that's not living. That's not life.
That's right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And that is the cult trap, by the way.
Yes,
I mean,
it is.
In a whole different kind of approaching it from left field in what we're talking about here. But really, the small world, the bubble world that you create, this alternate reality sort of universe that we talk about, that cult members get into, that's exactly what we're talking about, is they're making their world small. Limited it only to the culture of this group, the cult, right? Culture. Exactly. Culture, yeah. Exactly. Right. I love the wordplay of all of this, because it really helps define and clarify what the picture is. And that's a real shame, because there's a thing about life, which is grasping and owning and taking and just being able to deal with the fact that it is unpredictable by nature, by everything about it. And we're constantly fighting that with this prediction thing, right? So I think it's I think these are the bottom level kind of building blocks of us that explain so much of our behavior.
Yeah. I think you're hitting on something so poignant there, because whatever the group is or the religion or whatnot, they give you that excuse of so that's the devil trying to get me. Right. That's my ego getting in the way. That's my this or that. Yeah. And it's not actually helpful, but we think it is, right? Because it gives us this answer. Oh, well, if that's the devil that's causing me to sin, I have a recipe then that I can follow, and that's going to get me back into this space of certainty or stability, or in the good graces of my group, or connected, or whatever it might be. It does give us a sense of control, even while we're completely shaming ourselves. And so I think, I think that's kind of what you're talking about here. And it just twists our human needs in such a way that allows whoever the leaders of that group are to be the ones in control of us, and really making our lives so tiny.
Yeah, exactly. Because it becomes all about the cult and the cult leader and becoming that. I'm curious how else you have seen, or how you might talk about how religious trauma or spiritual trauma occurs to people outside of crazy Scientology stuff. You grew up in a fundamentalist group. You're familiar with that body, right? And that's way more common than the Scientology trauma. I mean, just numbers wise. So what sort of things are happening to people that they might not frame of or even think about as trauma inducing or phobia inducing? And yet there it is in this entire population of people you end up giving therapy to.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because before I ever really considered the religion I grew up in a cult or cult-like, it was really like, I like went to Book of Mormon on Broadway, right? And I had always been told more like the LDS Church, they're a cult, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, we believe all of the same things. And then like I watched read Leah Remini's book about her experience in Scientology, and I was like, I mean, we had some different beliefs, but like the underlying structure of it is the same. And I think that's what's so important to know is that these groups, whether they are high control groups or high control individuals, they are all coming from the same playbook. It might have a little bit of a different character flair to it, but underneath it, we're talking about dynamics of power and control. They're all coming from the same playbook. And almost, we like prediction. It's almost predictive, their behaviors and how they're going to handle things. And like oftentimes I'll work with clients, and I work with, or I used to work with a lot of domestic violence clients. And I would say, it's likely that this person is going to do blah, blah, blah this week. And they'd come back and they're like, how did you know that was going to happen? I was like, well, I'm not actually like a wizard. I just know that they have the same playbook. And so I think that's important because we can oftentimes get caught in well, this person had it worse, or this person didn't have to go through this. And that all that does is it breeds shame, which breeds isolation. And I am not about like trauma comparing or abuse comparing or control comparing, because if it happened to you and it was bad, then it was bad, right? Like it shouldn't have happened. And so I always want to lead with that, because I could give you a list of 55 things of here's all the things that I'm seeing, but I would miss some or I would overinflate others. And then that leaves the listener going, well, was it that bad then? Like, cause I didn't have, 10 of these on the list. I only had 5. Right. So I think, a term that I use a lot is called adverse religious experiences. It's similar to like the ACEs study, adverse childhood experiences. It's a term that some other colleagues and I came up with that we're doing research around. The difference though, it does depart from adverse childhood experiences in that there is subjectivity to it. An adverse religious experience doesn't need a qualifier of a researcher to say, oh, that was adverse. If it was adverse, it was adverse. If it impacted you, it impacted you. Now, we can say that there are certain things that are more likely to impact you maybe than others. So we could look at, different teachings around like your depravity as a human being. I grew up believing I was completely depraved. I didn't even deserve the air that I could breathe. Like I didn't deserve that. I was evil from the time that I came out of my mother's womb. That's a lot, right? To believe at my absolute core that I am this inherently evil person, that can really have an impact on you. And it is probably there's maybe a greater likelihood that would need to be processed in therapy than maybe somebody who didn't grow up believing that, right? Now, that doesn't mean that how they grew up was any better or worse, or it may or may not have impacts. But I think it's important to look at some of those beliefs when we have like eternal, like places of eternal conscious torment, whether we want to call that hell or, there's many different names for it. Those are often things where there's a lot of fear and hypervigilance and OCD behaviors. We might call that religious scrupulosity, where we go, okay, we're bringing that in. And those fears have created kind of this living reality where I'm hypervigilant all the time. Or if we look at teachings around sex, sexuality, gender, and the rules around that, there's oftentimes people with immense amounts of shame and guilt confusion, and then a variety of mental health disorder or dis-ease that comes out of that. So I think when we look at even just some of the teachings, we can start to see then that because of the control and the restrictions and the shame that is naturally a part of those teachings, we then start to see other behaviors and lifestyles and ways of thinking and relating to others that are maybe not conducive to healthy relationships, or just kind of navigating the world in a way that feels like it is in alignment with your values.
Yeah, that was great. That's a great answer. No, I really appreciate that over a laundry list. I really do, because your answer is actually evidence of a well-informed answer, right? Which is literally that it's relative, and exactly what you were talking about with trauma. It's like people are going to have different reactions to different stimuli, if you will, to different events. Yeah. And you can't, and I'm a big proponent of what you were talking about there in terms of let's not engage in trauma Olympics. I hate that. I really hate that. For a long time, I thought that was something valid and there was something to that. And then you come to realize after you learn about this stuff enough, you go, oh, no, it really is. Everybody's different. And if you're going to think that somebody has to go through what you had to go through, well, you know, projection isn't something that just happens in a movie theater, right? So that's
yes, exactly.
Yeah, so it's a funny thing. I want to ask you. I want to ask you about something kind of different. It's a little suppositional, I think, for you, but I wanted to find out your opinion on this, since it's connected somewhat with religion and religious belief. Maybe it's the other side of it in a way. I've noticed recently, and I've had some attention on this phenomena or this experience that some people have who are criminals, sociopaths, psychopaths, like people who are legit not good people, will have a religious experience, and they will experience a personality change. Now, this does not mean that they are now no longer their former selves, or that they are no longer aware of their former selves. I'm not talking about some kind of light switch phenomena, but there's an interesting thing that happens there where Jesus comes into their life or something like this. I was watching an interview with a guy recently who was a diagnosed sociopath who this happened to, and he talks very frankly about it. I became a preacher, in fact. I was fascinated by this model, right? And he's not the only one. We've seen this for years. Malcolm X, I mean, we can go back to that. People who literally were not good people and found religion and became good people. And this we might call the opposite of religious trauma. But I'm curious, but maybe not. And I'm a little curious about your professional or more personal take on that, just only because I'm curious. If you don't want to comment on it, I would understand.
No, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to think about, because of course we do have the lived experiences of people where this is their reality, right? I have a family member of mine that was, by like this raging alcoholic, and then found Jesus and never had a drop of alcohol again, and went to be, wanted to be a missionary and all these things, and lived out the rest of his life, in this different way. And so I can understand that. And I don't know all the technical terms. I feel like I was just maybe I was listening to the same interview that you were. Somebody's doing some research on this, like recently, and going like, what is this? These like kind of life-altering experiences. And, so sometimes, when things come in overwhelming, right? Like, it can change us. So I said, trauma is anything that's too much, too fast, too soon, that overwhelms our ability to cope. Yep. That does not just mean negative things. That can be anything. And it doesn't always lead to trauma, something that's too much, too fast, too soon, but it can, right? It can ultimately result in that. And so I think we could go the other way too, where say you're in a service and the quote unquote Holy Spirit is moving and we're singing and we're all these things. And we have this God experience where our lives are changed. I think there's a couple factors probably going on there, but I think that it could be real. I have a couple questions, which I'll get to in a second, but I think that sometimes the way that religious services are set up, not sometimes, they're set up in like hypnotic ways where they're like, I mean, they are geared towards opening your mind and messages kind of getting in, like making your brain more malleable so they'll stick as if you were like a child, and so I think there could be that happening, or a lot of influence. It could be a moment of, just in the depths of despair. And here's this like savior figure, and that's everything that I've ever needed. I think what I would question though is your life actually the same or like different? Or are there remnants of that old thing, but it's packaged a little bit prettier? Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is the family member that I talked about that said, didn't have another drop of alcohol, didn't, just left all of that debauchery behind and started following Christ. I do know, based off of family history and story, they were a dry drunk. They were very abusive to their family members, but it was under the scriptural laws, right? Husband, the head of the household, and children obey your parents. And right. And there was all these things that probably would have happened also if he had been drinking, but now we have this spiritual figure or spiritual authority to put over it. So it would be interesting to see like, okay, we have this diagnosed sociopath who then becomes a pastor. Well, a pastor is like an untouchable position. They're in a position of authority where others are looking up to them. And in some cases, they can do no wrong. And so I go, well, isn't that just that's like the perfect transition. Now I get to be a socially accepted sociopath and I've got God's favor, so nobody can question me. I can't think of a better role to be in as a sociopath, like if I'm a sociopath, right? So I don't want to belittle people's experiences. I just have questions.
Of course. And I did too. And it was interesting in the interview that I saw on this. And afterwards, I'll send you a link to it because you might be fascinated by it. A friend of mine did this interview on this guy. And I'm not basing all my thinking on this one interview. It's just the latest data point in a years long look at this stuff of, what is sociopathy and why do people act the way they do and what drives people to do such, to be such egotistical, self-focused, self-satisfying people who just can't give a thought to another person in the world. Well, okay, so you understand that there's a genetic and a nurture aspect to that, or you can even beat somebody into that as a kid, and there's genetic dispositions to that, and you get that, and you go, okay, I can kind of think with that. But then they have this moment in their life where they hit rock bottom, or they have what I'll call an epiphanal moment. Yeah. And I believe, personally, my initial total amateur hour theory here is that the highs and the lows, I believe, can turn on some kind of, for lack of a better term, hyperplasticity, where the personality changes in such it happens so quickly, and it's such a powerful change. I don't know what other word to use, right? Lot happening there.
I mean, I would agree with that in the sense that, so like there's many times I'll work with clients and I'll call them emotionally corrective moments where like in an instant, something happens that's maybe the opposite of what happened back then, but what they needed, right? And all of a sudden everything changes. Yeah. And I don't think it's magic. I think it is neuroscience and how our brains and bodies are wired to work together. And I don't think it happens all the time. Every single time you have an emotionally corrective moment, it's this, transformation. But I do think that it does happen. Yep. And so it would be ignorant of me it would not be wise to say, oh, certainly that couldn't happen to a sociopath. It could, right? Like, who am I to deny that? I'm not living inside their bodies. I just, have questions.
Absolutely. I do too. And it was interesting in the interview, as you'll see, that he says later on in the interview, he goes, look, I still have all these thoughts. I still have all these desires to do bad things. And this was a guy who admitted, he's the guy who had like 12 different incidents of road rage. He's the guy who would force you over to the side of the road and beat on your car if you didn't get out of it, so you could confront this guy. Like, this guy was a bad man, and he owns it. But he's very interesting in the way that he talks about it, and being the way that he is, of course, you have to take everything he's saying with a grain of salt. So you're kind of like, okay, well, I'm following with this, but I'm only conditionally accepting everything you're telling me about yourself. And so it's just an interesting phenomena, but it opens the door to the possibility that perhaps these emotional moments, these epiphanal moments, are they reproducible? Right. And if so, is that reproducibility a possible future even treatment modality? And this is, again, I'm way cart before the horsing right now. I know that this is totally suppositional on my part, but I'm always looking for inroads to understand and deal with this stuff,
I mean, isn't that what religion does all the time, though?
Right.
Every Sunday morning in churches across America, or Saturday nights, or whenever you have your service. Like, I think about, obviously this is not every church experience, but I think about again, I'm in the Bible Belt. There's, it's a stone's throw in any direction. Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with the pastor Greg Locke. He's gotten a lot of airtime. All too familiar, unfortunately. Yeah, yes. I can hear his services from my house. Like, he is, as the crow flies, a mile away from my house.
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh, I thought he was in Arizona. How interesting. Okay. I had him positioned all wrong in my head. How funny. Because unfortunately I've been exposed to a lot of that guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's not well loved here. I will say that, because he's just so mischievous and so disrespectful and all these things. But I use him as an example because multiple times a month, he will have these over-the-top services of, yelling and screaming and singing and book burning and like all of these things, right? And then there's all these converts, right? And so it's these people that are at these pivotal moments where they do something, they change. And so when you're proposing the idea of, could we use this as a treatment option? I would say yes, because there's many people that are already doing that with the guise of whatever their higher power is. Right. And I think there's other treatment modalities that are along those same lines. There's just maybe more guards put in place in terms of like research and ethics and, do no harm. But I know that some of the modalities, I am actually trained in hypnotherapy. I have a certification in that. I'm certified in EMDR. I'm certified in somatic experiencing. All of these modalities that are designed to have like shifts where I do X, Y, or Z, and literally my life can change, in a matter of moments. So I don't think it's outside the realm of possibilities. I personally would never want to foster a situation where like that's going to happen on purpose. But there are some people that do when we think about psychedelics and, other things like that. So it's a big question.
You're absolutely right. I love it. That's great. That's a great answer. I couldn't agree with everything you just said more, because there is a lot of trepidation and danger in this, because you don't know which direction the person's necessarily going to go. This is so unknown territory that I'm only throwing out possibilities of, like, I'm a little excited about the possibilities, but there are so many traps and pitfalls here, and so many opportunities for abuse, because we are literally talking about sort of the I hate this expression, the woof and warp, right? Like the pieces of what drives people's most intense life moments. And those moments can be really good, or they can be really bad. And the last thing you want to do is be responsible for somebody's worst moment in their life, kind of thing. It's like, I realized I'm a scumbag from hell and I need to go, self-harm now. It's like, no. That wasn't where we wanted to go with this. Right. So the safeguards and the ethics and all of that have to be very carefully taken into consideration with all of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think it's an interesting phenomenon, nevertheless, that we see in people. Okay, well, listen, all that being said, I've kind of gone a few minutes over our hour here, and I really appreciate your time, and thank you for contributing with this. I want to throw this out again, guys. There's this book. It's called When Religion Hurts Us or Hurts You. Okay, it's Dr. Laura Anderson. Where do they find this thing? How do they contact you if they want to or find your work?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yes. My book comes out October 17th everywhere. It's available for pre-order until then. So wherever you purchase your books, I gotta love the local bookstores. So go ahead and request it there or at your local library. It will be out on audiobooks as well. And so that's awesome. You can go to my website, drlauraeanderson.com, and there's links on there for, to purchase it. And I think through my publisher, it's like 40 or 50% off, which is kind of nice. And I also, like we said at the front of this episode, I am the director of the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, which you can find us at traumaresolutionandrecovery.com. And the reason I say that is because our main focus is working with individuals who are coming out of high control religions, groups, cults, fundamentalism, all the things that we're talking about here today. They all have their own stories, but they're all highly educated and trauma trained and trauma informed and all the things. And so one of the things I think we bring is that you don't ever have to convince us that it was that bad. We know it, right? Which, and so many people, they struggle because they go, I'm having to educate my therapist. I'm having to convince my therapist. And so there's something when somebody will come and they'll be like, oh, this is what I experienced. And it's like, oh, you're not questioning me? Like you just that can be really, really helpful. So we have practitioners. We are fully online so we can be accessed wherever you're at in the country or the world. We run groups, couples, individual, all the things. And we can be found, like I said, our website is traumaresolutionandrecovery.com. That's our Instagram handle as well. You can find me on any social media platform at Dr. Laura E. Anderson.
There you go, guys. All the links in the description section below to everything she just said. Yeah, check it out. This is perfect. I suspect we might want to talk again.
I would love that. This has been such a good conversation. It's so fun.
Good. I agree. I had a lot of fun talking with you about this. And now knowing more about what your center does, I feel compelled to at least do another show about what you guys are doing with survivors of cults and high control groups and how you go about your path of recovery on that. I'm intensely curious about that. And I'm curious to ask you about your opinions and takes on the role of education in all of this, because that's my big thing. So
I love it. Yes. Okay, let's do it again.
Yeah, let's do it again. Okay, excellent. All right, folks, I really hope you all enjoyed this. I got something out of it. We covered a lot of territory here. If you've been following my channel and what I've been talking about for a long time now, you saw us talking here about emotional needs. This is all about what this is all about. And understanding your emotional needs, understanding yourself is key to all of this and keeping yourself out of these red flag manipulative situations. So that all being said, thank you very much for coming around. I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.